Happy Mother's Day. We're going to break away from our tradition that when it's Mother's Day, I preach about mothers. I told Pastor Knapp, do I really have to preach about moms today? Is it okay? Because I ran out of moms messages. I think I've already, after 9 years, no, more than 14 years of preaching Mother's Day. And so anyway, but I have a very, very brief, encouraging word for the moms before I get into the message. And I just got it on the way to work this week, and it's 3 words: grace, erase, raise. Yay. Grr. When you're upset, you just remember grr. Grace, erase, raise. So grace meaning receive grace from God, first of all, for yourself, moms. Don't get into this pressure that every mom has to be perfect. I'm the only perfect mom. And so, by that I'm definitely imperfect. But nobody is a perfect mom, but we do our best and we give out perfectly. Okay, we're not perfect, and so I want all the moms to receive grace today and be gracious to yourself so that you can be gracious to your children, and you can also release grace to your spouse. So grace, and number 2, erase, meaning start afresh every day. Erase yesterday's frustration, erase yesterday's household chores that your kids did not do. Erase the disappointment. Do not carry it with you on a new day. Erase, okay, moms? So you wake up in the morning, stop thinking about the laundry yesterday that was not done. Erase. So grace, erase, and then raise. Don't forget to raise a praise. Okay? Don't forget to raise your praise, because it's praise that causes our hearts to remain in thanksgiving and in that attitude of seeing the goodness of God no matter what the circumstances are. When we develop that attitude of praise, moms, we develop the attitude of seeing what God is doing rather than what God is not doing. Okay? So grace, erase, raise. Okay, everybody turn to a mom near you and say, grace, erase, raise. All right, let's pray. That's it. All right, are you ready for the word today? Mark chapter 1. So I'm continuing on Pastor Knapp's series on the Gospel of Mark, and I really I struggled. I tried to come up with a mom's message, but I kept going back to the Gospel of Mark after what Pastor Knapp has been preaching the last 2 Sundays. And so we're going to go into Mark chapter 1, verse 16 to 20. And I'm reading from the New King James Version. Are you there? Okay, we're there. And as he walked by the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and Andrew, his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. Then Jesus said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you become fishers of men." They immediately left their nets and followed him. Next. When he had gone a little farther from there, he saw James, the son of Zebedee, and John his brother, that's John the Beloved, the writer of the Gospel of John, and 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and John his brother, who also were in the boat, mending their nets. And immediately he called them, and they left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired servants, and went after him. That's it. Jesus tells Simon and Andrew, James and John, "Follow me, and I will make you become fishers of men." And according to Mark, they immediately dropped everything they did and followed him. How many of you would read that story and say, "Really? That's it?" I'm like that. And Mark is a typical guy telling a story. You know how wives, or maybe, when you ask, or kids, maybe when you ask your dad, "How was the movie?" "It was good." That's it? It was good? Yeah. Did you even have popcorn? Yeah. That's it? Yeah. What was the best parts of the movie? Oh, there were a lot of good parts. That's Mark telling the story. And so as a woman, I like to dig in deeper. And I went through all the Gospels. So Matthew tells the same story. Matthew and Mark are buddies. And so they tell, I was telling Pastor Knapp, I think so Mark is the first Gospel that was written. And Matthew followed after. And then I believe it was John and then Luke, or Luke and John, and if I remember my Bible school right, and Pastor Knapp's like, yeah, Mark was the first one to write that story, and I said, okay, Matthew followed after and really wrote the same thing, and Matthew used to be a tax collector, so he just cheated. He just, okay, what did you say about that? I'll copy. But Matthew and Mark tell the same account in the same way. It's that Jesus just came to Peter, Simon, and Andrew, and James and John and said, follow me, and they immediately dropped everything and then followed him. And I'm not satisfied with that, and I'm so thankful that one of the Gospels is written by a doctor, because doctors are very detailed and women love details. And so thank God for Dr. Luke. So Luke was a doctor, and he liked to investigate further, and so he was able to grab the details from this story, and it's exactly the same account, but he was able to extract the details. So let's go to Luke chapter 5 verse 1 to 11. Luke chapter 5 verse 1 to 11. So it was, as the multitude pressed about him to hear the word of God, that he stood by the lake. He is Jesus. He stood by the lake of Gennesaret, and the lake of Gennesaret is actually the more modern name of the Sea of Galilee. So when Mark says he stood by the Sea of Galilee, and Luke says by the lake of Gennesaret, because the Gospel of Luke was written later on, and it was later on called the lake of Gennesaret. Lake of Gennesaret, and saw two boats standing by the lake, but the fishermen had gone from them and were washing their nets. Then he got into one of the boats, which was Simon's, and asked him to put out a little from the land. And he sat down and taught the multitudes from the boat. When he had stopped speaking, he said to Simon, launch out into the deep and let down your nets for a catch. But Simon answered and said to him, Master. Okay, so Simon calls Jesus Master, and in the Greek word for which this account was written, the word master is equal to teacher. Okay, teacher or master, we have toiled all night and caught nothing. Nevertheless, at your word, I will let down the net. And when they had done this, they caught a great number of fish, and their net was breaking. So remember in the Gospel of Mark, James and John were mending their nets? Were mending their nets, fixing their nets. Why? Because the net was broken because of the multitudes of the catch. There's the detail. So they signaled to their partners in the other boat to come and help them. And they came and filled both the boats, so that they began to sink. When Simon Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, Depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord. So notice at the first part, Peter calls Jesus teacher, and then after the miracle, Peter calls Jesus Lord. We're going to unpack that later. For he and all who were with him were astonished at the catch of fish which they had taken. And so also were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon. And Jesus said to Simon, Do not be afraid. From now on, you will catch men. So when they had brought their boats to land, they forsook all and followed him. There's our details. I want to talk today about when Jesus steps into our boat. I just came up with that title. Like, Lord, what is my title? And then I just love the idea that, you know how Mark cut the whole story short. Bottom line, they forsook all and followed Jesus. There you go. But Luke broke it down for all of us who are wondering, what made these 4 fishermen forsake everything and follow Jesus? What made them decide to follow Jesus? Just drop everything, their own career, their own profession. Now remember, in their day, in the town of Galilee, Galilee was known as a village of fishery. So fishing was their primary economic livelihood in that village. And fishermen were known to be uneducated. They were known to be unlearned. They were known to not have credentials or any sort of pedigree wherein they should be recognized or whatnot. And here's Peter, and here's Simon. He was still called Simon. Simon and Andrew, James and John, they were business partners. They were fishing partners. And all night, we find out in this story that all night they had been fishing. How many of you know that the best time, how many of you like fishing? Raise your hand. Okay. Now, how many of you have tried fishing with a drag net? Yeah? How many of you know that evening is the best time to fish? Yes? And I only knew that because my dad grew up in a fishing village, and they always went out in the middle of the night to catch fish because it's always the best time to catch fish. And so here's Peter, James, John, and Peter's brother Andrew, and they spent all night trying to fish, and this was their career. This was their profession. They were professional fishermen, uneducated as they were. They lived off from whatever catch they got. And all night, the best time to catch fish, they caught nothing. They basically reached morning with a sense of failure that they had toiled all night, worked hard as they could, and literally caught nothing. Zilch, zero, nada. They caught nothing at all despite their hard work. And here's Jesus coming by the lake of Gennesaret, and he steps into the boat, the place where they felt was a failure that morning. Jesus steps into the boat, and Jesus was now known as a teacher, but everybody knew that he was a carpenter by profession. He was not a fisherman. And so Jesus steps into Peter's boat and says to Peter, take your boat a little farther. Farther from the land, so that I can teach to the multitudes. So we're from that context, we know that there were a lot of people waiting for Jesus to hear. But it's very interesting that Jesus steps into the boat that was a sign of failure for these 4 fishermen, and chose that to be his platform for his teaching that morning. Very interesting. And what we're going to do today is we're just going to unpack this whole story and try to get some nuggets of truth that I pray. My prayer is that we would all be inspired by the response, and not just by the response, but by how Jesus called the 4 fishermen. So Jesus does not step into Peter's boat and immediately say, launch into the deep. No, he just asked Peter to go a little bit farther from the land, not to the deep. And how many of you know that many times in our lives, Jesus steps into our mess, into our disappointment, into our failure, like Peter's evening experience, like these 4 fishermen. Jesus steps into the boat, and he does not immediately challenge us to go deep. He just asks us to go a little bit far with him. And here's Jesus inside Simon Peter's boat, and he asks Peter, take your boat a little farther from the land. I wonder what went on in Peter's mind at that moment. They're exhausted. They're filled with disappointment. They probably don't have anything, not probably, they did not have anything to sell that day. And they probably didn't have anything to cook that morning because they didn't catch anything. And so now this teacher wants to use his boat, and he does not even ask Peter, can I use your boat? He actually asked Peter to maneuver the boat, to stay in the boat. And Peter has not slept yet. Peter and Andrew and James and John, they haven't slept yet, but he wanted them to stay with him in the boat and take it back to where it was, back into the reminder of their failure, back into the reminder of their unfruitful labor. And he says, take your boat a little farther so that I can teach the multitudes. And from that point, Peter, it's interesting because Peter didn't complain anything at all. He didn't complain at all. He didn't say, Lord, you can take my boat. And I'm going home. Right? He just said, okay, I'll let you. Okay, I'll do as you say. He takes a little step of obedience, not knowing that Jesus was actually setting him up and testing him to be his follower. See, so many times that's how Jesus enters into our life. He enters into that moment of feeling like we're exhausted, we're weary, we're at our wits' end, we're at the edge of a major decision in life, and it feels like we've been unfruitful, we've been making so much effort, but having so little compared to what we were hoping for. And he steps into our boat and he asks us to take a little step of obedience. He does not immediately ask Peter to forsake everything and follow him. He asks Peter to just take the boat with him a little far from the land, because land signified comfort zone. And so I want to propose today that Jesus' call on Simon, Andrew, James, and John's life started with that one little instruction. And because they obeyed that one little instruction, Jesus takes them further. So here's Jesus in the boat teaching the multitudes, and Simon and Andrew, James and John are not complaining. They're just sitting down. They're probably listening to Jesus teaching too. I would assume, I would think that they would. They're probably sleeping because they haven't slept that night. And so they're in the same boat with Jesus, and they've obeyed a little. And then Jesus looks at them and says, launch into the deep. Meaning to say, we're leaving from this little bit far from the land. We're going to go deep. We're going to go deep to where you were, yes, last night. We're going to go deep to where you had your disappointment. We're going to go deep to where you had that feeling of failure. We're going to go deep, and I want you to cast your net. I want you to do it again. Not the failure. I want you to try again. See, what Jesus was pointing out here is that Jesus was challenging Simon. Okay, Simon, you've obeyed me a little. Let's go to the deep. Let's go together to the deep. And what Jesus was trying to say, Simon's response is typical of those of us who have just failed at something and then facing God's command to do it again. I don't know about you, but I've failed so many times in my attempt to obey God. How many of you can relate? I failed so many times trying to obey God, but sometimes here's Jesus stepping into Peter's boat, and Jesus tells Peter, try to do it again, because this time I'm here with you in this same boat. Jesus stepped into the boat, and what I was getting was, as I was reading, is that is exactly the picture of what Jesus has done for each one of us. When he went to the cross, he stepped in the boat of our mess. He stepped in the boat of our sin. He stepped in the boat of our disappointments, of our discouragement, of our pain. He stepped in the boat. He took it all on the cross, he stepped in the boat because Jesus does not call us to follow him from afar. He first establishes connection. He reconciled us to the Father so that he can call us to follow after him. He does not call us from afar and say, come and try to reach my level. He goes to our level, steps in the same boat as where we are, meets us where we are. That's exactly the picture of the cross, friends. Is that at the cross was a picture of our boat. He stepped in the boat of my sexual abuse. He stepped in the boat of years and years of feeling filthy and nobody knowing that I was feeling dirty all the time because of that incident. And so he stepped in that boat, and because he stepped in the boat, he was able to call me out. Jesus does not call us to follow him without first stepping in our boat. He steps into our boat and then he says, I know you've been trying to obey me. I know you've been trying to live your life right, but you always constantly feel like you're a failure and you're always constantly feeling that you fall short. But not this time, because I am in the boat with you, Peter. Peter responds like any of us. He said, it's like Jesus telling you got to forgive your husband. Or for the husbands, you got to forgive your wife. And you would say, well, kind of sounding like Peter, well, I've done that. Didn't work. Didn't change my spouse. Didn't change my child. Did not change my boss. I've forgiven my boss how many times? Did not change my boss. Peter sounded like that. Well, Jesus, you know what? And I feel like Peter was even trying to be polite because he knew Jesus had no fishing experience. And here's Jesus in broad daylight telling them, 4 fishermen with years of experience, to cast their net in broad daylight after working hard at the perfect time for fishing and failed. And Peter was trying to be polite. Well, Jesus, we tried that last night. In fact, we tried it all night and it did not work. Aren't you a carpenter? Let's be real. Like, I believe Peter was trying to hold back. And Peter's always like, oh yes, Jesus, I will never fail you. I will never deny you. I will die for you. And then when Jesus was arrested, Peter was like, no, I don't know him. 3 times. Like, Peter just had no filters. But this time, he actually tried to have a filter. He said, Jesus, we did that all night, but and he was being polite. He said, nevertheless, at your word. But here's what's interesting is because I believe Jesus knew everything. Jesus knew that they worked all night. Jesus knew that they were bound with disappointment and that sense of exhaustion coming from failure. Jesus understood that quite well. But Jesus was not afraid to challenge their disappointment with his word. And church, I want us to get into that place where we allow Jesus to challenge our pain with his word. Where we allow Jesus to challenge our disappointment with his word. Well, Jesus, I've tithed, but I'm still not rich. And Jesus would tell you, well, let's take a look at your stewardship. Or Jesus, I've forgiven more than 70 times 7. But Lord, he still keeps doing it. And nevertheless, at your word. See, I believe, church, that Peter's turning point was that statement. Nevertheless, at your word. What was happening when Peter said that was that he was saying, I will not presume that my experience will determine my present. Because you release the word, it doesn't matter if the situation looks similar to what I tried last night and failed. But at your word, see, his word makes the huge difference. It's at your word, Jesus. Nevertheless, at your word. And I believe it was at that moment that Peter, without knowing, qualified himself to be a follower and even one of the apostles. It's just that moment where he said, Lord, we've worked all night. Nevertheless, he did not end it with a statement of his disappointment. He chose to step beyond his experience. He chose to step beyond the exhaustion. He chose to step beyond what his professional background knew so well. He chose to step out of that and said, nevertheless, at your word, I will let down the net. How does that sound like? Nevertheless, Lord, at your word, I will forgive. Nevertheless, Lord, at your word, I will love my child unconditionally. Nevertheless, Lord, at your word, I will let down the nets. I will do what you said, even if I tried that before and did not work. But because you're telling me that again now, I will do it. This reminds me of when we were in college, and I think I probably have mentioned this story before, that when we were in college and we were at the dorm, and this was I was already second year, and at the start of second year at the dorm, we were so gung-ho about our faith. We had a Bible study going on at the dormitory, and we wanted everyone to get saved and saw a vision of the whole dorm getting saved. Jesus, bring everyone into salvation. We're so passionate about seeing everyone experience the love of God. So we tapped a lot of invitations every week on each door of our dormitory. We put out a lot of invitations to our Bible study, and after a year of seeing each of those dorm mates, because there were only probably 4 of us in the Bible study that year, and after seeing dorm mates in front of us crumple our invitation and throw it down in the trash. We did it 1 year though, but every week for the whole year we did it, and we kept seeing our invitation in the trash. We kept seeing them throwing our invitation down the trash, and so after a whole year we stopped. It's like, Lord, we give up. You invite them. and the following year on my 3rd year, basically, we just kept on gathering. We kept praying for our dorm, and we kept praying for people for hearts to be softened. And one night, while we were worshiping in the lobby with our Bible study group, this particular dorm mate of ours that always was notorious for crumpling it in front of us, she was like, how come you guys never put your invitations again? It was very interesting because at that moment, before she said that, we actually had a discussion. You know what? We haven't put out invitations, and maybe we should do it again. And we were all like, well, we did that for 1 year. And rejection is hard, and we did it. And then this young girl that was so notorious about crumpling that invitation, she said, how come we don't see your invitations anymore? You guys don't. And so we said, well, we don't want you to have more trash. He said, no, we actually look forward to your invitation. And so make the long story short, we started putting out invitation, and our Bible study group grew that year. But see, I know the feeling of disappointment. I know the feeling of constant trying to do God's will and nothing. You don't see nothing. But at the time of God, in God's time. See, sometimes it's all about the timing of God. And in God's time, when God says, go invite that unbelieving atheist professor of yours again, and you said, I tried last year, didn't work. But when God gives you that instruction, just do it. Nike. Because at your word, nevertheless, at your word, I could tell you story after story. I remember when we started in our university, and everybody was saying that, oh, you can never just try to be a Christian at the end of your 4th year. You know, don't lose your Christianity. That's your goal. And we're like, what about a campus revival? And everyone was like, no, that can never happen. We tried for many years. These were 4th year university students. We tried for many years. Doesn't work. There's a lot of atheists here. There's a lot of agnostics here. There's a lot of activists that don't care about Jesus. You know, we tried hard. As long as you're a Christian when you graduate. And we were like, you know what? What if you tried for so many years, but at this season, in this season, God is releasing a word where this whole campus will experience him. And so there was that whole batch of us that believed that this whole campus is going to experience him. And at that year, before we graduated, we literally had a first time ever in that whole university when no Christian organization was ever given the UP fair, the university-wide fair in our sunken garden, and everyone was always having, do you know that every year people die from frat wars at every school fair, every university fair in our sunken garden? And that year, we were like, Lord, you promised that you're giving us a whole university. It was the first time ever that they opened up one whole night to all Christian organizations. So we were able to invite Gary V. We were able to invite Gary V as a Christian artists in the Philippines. And so we were able to invite, and people got saved in a university event that was known to be full of drunk people and high and killing and gang wars, Bloods and Crips and Apos and all the frats. And why? Because nevertheless, at your word, some people may have tried hard, but at your word, what is it that God's been telling you to do, and you tried to do it before, and you're afraid to do it because you've done it before and it didn't work? Nevertheless, at your word. Peter did not allow his previous failure, his past experience, and that phrase alone is so full of error, past experience you don't experience in the future. You know, Peter did not allow his experience to define his present outcome. What is God telling you to do now that you have been holding back? Because you've done that before and it did not work. It's time to say, nevertheless, at your word, Lord, I will do it. Simon, with that phrase, showed that he was teachable. See, being teachable is allowing God to challenge the mindsets that we have based on our experience. You know that the hardest mindset to break is the mindset that's based on experience? Oh no, my husband is so... I'm not talking about Pastor Knapp. I'm not talking about any husband here. Does not happen in Champion Life Center. Okay, let's change examples. Oh no, my child. No, I'm not talking about any child. Oh no, my neighbor will never do that, you know? That my neighbor will never be open to any invitation to church. Oh yeah, I've tried to talk about Jesus before, and when I talked, he would immediately turn his back. Oh, I would never, I don't know. Oh, but he got diagnosed with cancer. Just an example, okay? I'm not talking about a real neighbor. Got diagnosed with cancer. Oh yeah, I've mentioned it before, but he's so closed. And it's experience that actually builds a mindset within us that causes us to disobey God. And so what we're learning here from Peter is that I will not let experience overrule God's command. I will not let experience overrule God's command. So if God tells me to tithe, okay, I will not let experience overrule God's command. If God tells me to honor my boss, who does not deserve to be honored, with the way he treats us, I will not let experience overrule God's command. That is what being teachable means. It's Peter saying, I'm the professional fisherman. You're the teacher of the law. You used to be a carpenter. When did you go fish again? You know, Peter did not do that. Peter said, nevertheless, at your word. And so Peter witnessed this miracle, and this whole miracle caused Peter, Andrew, James, and John to encounter Jesus as more than just a teacher, so that they started calling him Lord. The word Lord means absolute ownership of rights to everything. Their encounter with Jesus, the miracle caused them to be confronted with the lordship of Jesus. But here's another thing that we learn. Peter says, nevertheless at your word. Peter sees the miracle, and his response is, depart from me, O Lord, for I am a sinful man. You need to say, Lord, I don't deserve this. And that is a picture of recognizing our wretchedness. And see, church, listen. It's very ironic, but the qualification to be able to follow Jesus is you must first see your utter wretchedness to really acknowledge the value of the one in front of you. Isaiah the prophet in Isaiah 6 sees the Lord. His train fills the temple. He has this encounter with the Lord, and his first response is, woe is me, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I belong to a people of unclean lips. The first response to a miracle was not, wow, Lord, you're amazing. Let's be buddies. Let's be fishing partners. No, the first response of Peter and his friends to God's miracle at that moment was, we don't deserve this. And church, it is the irony of King of the Kingdom. But for us to be able to be equipped to follow Jesus, we must constantly see, because you will never pursue someone or something that you don't see a real value in. And if you don't recognize your wretchedness, if I don't recognize my need to be cleansed from this constant feeling of filthiness, if I did not recognize my need for a healer to heal my wounds of rejection, if I did not recognize the ugly me, I would never see the beauty of Jesus and decide to drop everything to follow him all the days of my life. If I will never recognize my failure as it is, if I never recognize my need for a Lord, not just a need for a miracle worker, but a need for a Lord, then I will never forsake everything to follow Jesus. To this day, my constant prayer, church, is that after many years, I got saved 7 years old. Praise the Lord. I'm not going to say how many years that has been. But after many years of following the Lord, my constant prayer is, God, cause me to constantly see my need for you. Because the moment I forget that I utterly need him, I will easily get distracted by all the good things around me. Peter, James, and John, and Andrew were willing to forsake their source of livelihood because they saw the source of life. They witnessed the source of life. They witnessed the Lord of life, so much so that the value of their profession and career seemed nothing compared to pursuing Jesus. No, I'm not telling everybody to resign tomorrow. That's not what the message is about. I'm not telling us to quit our jobs. I'm saying, where is your heart? What is your heart pursuing? Because all of us are in some boat, one way or another. All of us, our hearts are in a boat. Our hearts are in a place where it is pursuing, whether it's our livelihood, our profession, our career, the ideal family life that we picture, the ideal Canadian life that we envision, having a nice home with a cottage by the lake and a boat that I can go about. And we have this, all of us are pursuing something because we see a value in that something. And until we recognize our utter wretchedness, the way Simon recognized and said, Lord, I do not deserve this. Depart from me. I am so sinful. He recognized at that moment that I am in need to be cleansed because I don't deserve to be with someone like this. And Jesus' response was, do not be afraid, for I'm going to make you a fisher of men. He didn't say, Peter, don't be afraid, you're going to be a fisher of men. He actually emphasized the phrase, I will make you. It's interesting because Peter knew what fishing was all about, and Jesus tells him, I will make you a fisher of men. Because it's no longer, Peter, your strength. It's no longer about your gifts, Peter. This may be your boat, but I just owned it right now. With this catch, I just owned it right now. I just showed you right now that you may have the experience, but I am the Lord. You may have the background, but I am the Lord. And it has nothing to do with your ability. Sometimes God takes us to a place that reminds us of our failure and redeems that failure so he can remind us that it's not about our giftings. It's not about our skill. It's about him owning the situation. When we were in the Philippines still as pastors, and Pastor Knapp, you know his story. If you don't, just go to YouTube. YouTube 700 Club, Pastor Nat Lumasag, because they thought his name was Nat, N-A-T. It's not Nat. It's Nat. I know, I'm running out of time. But it's been a long time since I've preached. Give me time, right? This is what happens when I take a long break. And so we know Pastor Knapp's story about him getting kicked out of that high school for selling drugs. And when he became a youth pastor, when we served in the youth ministry, that same high school contacted him and said, we want you to talk to the students that got caught doing drugs, because you started the drug test anyway. And so he ended up counseling the students from that high school who kicked him out. What is that? That's called redemption. God takes you to a place of your failure where you were kicked out and reminds you, see what I can do through you. Simon, this was your failure, but I have turned your failure into your biggest miracle catch. And God takes us into the deep, because it's only in the deep that our issues are confronted. See, when you're in the shallow, you can jump off boat. You can jump off the boat and swim back, right? But when you're in the deep, you got to stay in the boat. Jesus is calling us, church, to go deep. Go deep from your comfort zone. Allow him to dig into what is uncomfortable in you. Allow him to expose some issues so that not to shame you, it's to redeem you. He allows Peter to confront his failure so that he can redeem the failure and turn it into his miracle catch. So much so that he needed other boats. Their nets were broken. That school that Pastor Knapp was kicked out from was across a country club where he used to go and do drugs too. See, he liked to mark his territory. and that same country club, I tell you, God has a sense of humor, because that same country, he said I would come here with my friends and do drugs while some of our friends try to play golf or whatnot. And they used to do drugs in that country club. And when he became the senior associate pastor, we started a service in that same country club. And he went into the washroom where he used to do drugs and said, I used to do it here, now I'm preaching here. What is that? It's redemption, church. It's redemption. Jesus wants to redeem every area in our life. Your failure is not the end of your story. Your failure is the opportunity for, I'm not telling you to fail deliberately. I'm not telling you to make mistakes deliberately. I'm just saying that all of us will eventually. But that is just a setup. That is why we can sing He's the living hope. Because even in our walk with God, we are going to fail once in a while. I tell you, if Peter denied Jesus after walking on water, if he could deny Jesus, and then when Jesus resurrected, Jesus meets them at the shore, and he meets them at the shore when they went back fishing and did not catch all night. It was like a rewind of the first encounter they had with Jesus. And he tells them, go throw your net on the other side. And then they caught another miracle. What was that? It's Jesus redeeming Jesus was telling them, I've redeemed you at the start. I will continue to redeem you. Every step we take, there's always a risk of failure. But that is why perfect love casts out fear, because perfect love redeems. No matter how long we've walked with Jesus, we'll never perfect it. But his redemption is perfect. Covers everything.